All right, we'll kick off there. Okay, so thanks for coming. This is our last session. Concurrently, two last sessions, but this is 4B on precarity and exclusion. We're joined today by Professor James Wickham, who will be presenting to us findings from a joint paper with Dr. Sinéad Pembroke and Dr. Alicja Bobek, both the UCD, on precarious work and access to healthcare in Ireland. Mr. Michael O'Brien from the Fisheries campaign and the International Transport Workers Federation. Mr. Daniel Hoey, Research Coordinator with Focus Ireland. So we'll start with James, and we have plenty of time. It's, you know, I won't cut you off. 20 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes, and I think we'll have some spare time for discussion afterwards. Anyway, so whenever you're ready, Professor, go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Kieran. Right, just start my own timer. Yeah, okay, this is about precarious work and access to healthcare in Ireland, and it's some data mining really from a project from TASC on the social implications of precarious work. It's based on two reports which we did with TASC. First of all, and most importantly, report Living with Uncertainty, and then also a report written by Sinead on precarious work and precarious lives. And those reports are sitting on the TASC website. Off we go. Okay, the precarious work project started from the idea that we have to start unbundling precarity. You know, everybody talks about precarious work. It's become for about the last 10 years a buzzword. But what that means is that all sorts of different forms of work get bundled in together. Our basic starting point was, as I say, the need to unbundle precarity, look at different forms of work. And our key hypotheses really were that if you want to understand the impact of precarious work on people's lives, and indeed on the wider society, you need to think about the relationship between individuals and the welfare state. The impact of precarious employment, so we suspect, is moderated by the welfare state. Crudely speaking, that means that precarious work is going to have very different consequences in, let's say, at one extreme, the United States, at the other extreme, Sweden, because they have very different sorts of welfare state. And the other argument that we were pushing forward was that how precarious work is experienced depends also on people's household situation and their situation in the life course. Very crudely, there's a world of difference between a student living at home with relatively affluent parents, doing part-time work, which is precarious, in a bar, and a single mother with doing precarious work, perhaps the same sort of work, or perhaps working in retail, but with no support apart from possibly social welfare. So you have to look at people's household situation. First, and then you also have to start being very clear what precarious work is and what precarious work isn't. Precarious work is often contrasted with thought of as the same as non-standard work, but it's not. At its simplest, what this chart shows us is we have here the different sorts of work and three basic categories: whether people are employed or not, whether they're employees or non-employees, whether the work is standard or non-standard, and whether it's precarious. And if we take low-paid employment, for example, that's not non-standard work. It can be normal work, but it's low pay. But it's not necessarily precarious. Just because you're not getting a decent wage doesn't mean to say you're in precarious employment. Equally, for example, a part-time work. Part-time work is the classic non-standard form of work. It's non-standard, people are employed, but it's not necessarily precarious. Part-time work is not the same. No, it's not necessarily precarious work. There are all other sorts of precarious work, range from bogus self-employment, which has been discussed in some other sessions, the portal economy or gig economy, and crucially for what we're going to look at today, people on temporary contracts. So precarious work is not the same thing as non-standard work, and it's not necessarily the same thing as low-paid work. Our project essentially focused on 40 qualitative interviews with people doing precarious work. And as the chart shows you, we group them really in terms of first of all, of their household situation, that's the rows, and in the columns, the form of work. So we looked at people in part-time working regular hours, we looked at people self-employed with no employees, and we looked at people in fixed-term contracts. And we're going to be particularly interested really in this third column here. The sampling was a convenient sampling using various social networks in which people were involved and which our key informants were involved in. And what we're doing really in this report overall and in this particular paper is making a virtue of our own failure, because we ended up, despite our very best efforts, with a disproportionate number of people in what we would call semi-professional and semi-professional work, and often with good qualifications. And this is one of the key things, I think, that when we start thinking about precarious work and unbundling it, that really it is simply not the case that precarious work is just about low-paid, unskilled work. There are all sorts of precarious work, growing precarious work, which is now, if you like, replacing or undermining traditional forms of really non-precarious, regular work. We're talking essentially about the transformation of professional work, or if you like, middle-class work. Put that a little bit in context, some of the different forms of precarious work. There's a lot of work on bogus self-employment, especially in construction industry, and Alicia and myself have written quite a lot about this, which incidentally has been facilitated by the tax system. There's also a lot of work on precarious work with irregular part-time work, so-called, although it's officially illegal in Ireland, zero-hour contracts, which of course is widespread in the hospitality industry. And in the context of the employment effect of COVID, of course, this is absolutely crucial. But what we're particularly interested in for this paper is something which relatively little is written about, which is temporary people working on temporary and short-term contracts. It's ranged across the occupational structure, but the increase seems to have been particularly prevalent in so-called professional occupations. Turning to health, because what we're interested in for this paper is the implications of precarious work for health. There is quite a large literature on the implications of precarious work for health, but most of this looks, if you like, directly. It looks at the implication of the sort of work that people do, which is when it's precarious, on their health. What, however, we started getting interested in was what you might call the indirect effect of precarious work on health, the way in which precarious work, however, whether or not it's actually experienced as precarious work, impacts on people's health in terms of how they can or cannot access healthcare. And the moment you say that, you have to start thinking about the different healthcare systems in developed countries. I suppose one crude typology would be where healthcare is essentially insurance-based, which is historically the situation in continental Europe. And if you think about that, that has tended to prioritize people in regular employment and until relatively recently, also male head of households. At the opposite extremes of that, actually, is the British situation. With the UK, with its NHS, world famous, which is essentially taxation funded and free at the point of access. And widespread in, actually as a model, although we don't admit this, in Ireland, is of course the situation in the USA, where there is very residual public provision of health, and it's essentially funded by private incomes, which means, of course, massively insurance. And this creates, we suspect, a double whammy, because you have widespread precarious employment, but you also have very, very unequal access to health. Notice, incidentally, in passing, that the typologies of healthcare systems don't map directly onto the sort of typologies of welfare states that we're all used to, Aspirations, 3 worlds of welfare, and that sort of thing. Ireland's situation is actually very, very unique. We have a 2.5 tier system. We have private health insurance. 46% of the population have some form of private health insurance. This has varying levels of coverage. Some health insurance that people buy is actually very little. Some pays for almost everything. We have the community loading system, which creates a sudden expense for people joining the systems late. And Ireland is very unusual in the extent of private system across Europe. And I think, though I'd like to see more research on this, I think it's unusual in the remarkably aggressive expansion of private healthcare systems and private insurance in recent decades. For a rather smaller proportion of this population, that is, we have a situation where about a third have medical card and access the public system. Public provision, of course, especially in terms of GP care, has expanded a lot in recent years. But these aren't walled off systems. Many people use both. People have the choice, though it's a remarkably constrained choice, to use the private system or the public system. And crucially, about 20 to 30% of the population are not covered by any form of medical card or free access to the health system, but on term also are not covered by private health insurance. So we have a sort of uninsured half of the uninsured half tier, if you like. And these people, crucially, tend to be young and tend also to be in precarious employment. Now, what I'm going to do in the rest of the paper is show you some of the implications of that. I stress this is obviously very much qualitative interviewing. What we really, in order to really start getting at this, we need a lot more quantitative data on the relationship, simply on how people actually do or don't access health. There's remarkably little good information on that actually in Ireland, and the relationship to employment. But I think these at least give us some hypotheses as to what is going on. Okay, first of all, 2 of our interviewees talking about problems with accessing healthcare. Mary, on a fixed-term contract, says, well, I don't get a medical card even though my illness, like asthma, is chronic. You've got inhalers and tablets every month, but I'm not entitled to a medical card because I live at home. So it goes off my wages and it goes off my mum's wages. Mary, incidentally, is an early years educator on a fixed-term contract. Kira, very different sort of work. She's a postdoc, researcher. She says, I can't afford PHI, private health insurance, which is a big issue for me now as I'm 35. So thinking also of the community loading issue. So a very simple point is that lots of people don't have access to the sort of insurance that you want, to the sort of healthcare that you would expect them to have. You would expect somebody like Mary to have access to universal public system. You would expect somebody in job like Kira has to have access to private insurance, but no. The consequences are health deprivation. It means very simply that people don't get the access to health care that they expect and need. Peter, an English language teacher in regular part-time work, says, I have no health insurance and I have no medical card. And when it comes to going to doctors, you just don't go. So the absolutely basic thing that many people simply don't go to the doctor when they should. Kira says, I've been in situations where I put off going to doctor. Remember one situation starting with a cold, 2 weeks later it was chest infection, and I got really sick, and I had to take days off work, and eventually had to pay some money. So one of the classic things that healthcare professionals will always tell you, when things start getting bad, you get to a doctor. If you put it off, it'll be worse. And Paula, another early years educator, says, I used to be on the pill, but you have to go back every 6 months to see your doctor again, which is 60 quid. So I've come off that. So people are simply not accessing the sort of healthcare that you would expect them to have. And the implication, of course, is that their health suffers as a result. Notice this is not because the work they do directly, it's because the work is irregular and precarious, and consequently, that's me telling me it's not, they can't get the access they need. What this creates is a situation of dependency. People in part-time, in irregular work, in precarious work, are dependent on other people for access to health. Claire says, I have this stomach problem. I was on a waiting list for 1.5 years to see a specialist, so I finally got to see last week, 1.5 years. I got a left day with an appointment for my test that need to be done next year. And this incidentally, the data is of course pre-COVID, but we're talking about several years waiting. So my dad is saying to me to go private and he'll pay for it. I don't have the money to do it privately. So Claire is dependent on her father, in this case, for access to health. Or Noah, a home care assistant, says the same sort of thing. With my recent back situation, I can't pay those consultants. My parents must pay them. I have health insurance through my parents, but they only give you a small percentage of things back. So people are dependent in particular on their parents, but we also had people pointing out they were dependent on their partners for access to health. And this has all sorts of consequences. In one sense, it's infantilization. We're talking about adults. We're talking in their 20s and 30s. But Noel, as Noel points out, he's not in control of his health insurance, which is one of course, the things that the private enterprise lobby lauds about healthcare, about private healthcare, that you're in control. No, you can't be, because you're dependent on somebody else. I'm just a named person on the policy, so I don't even control it. I can't call the health insurance and discuss the details. Has to be my parents. Talk about another bloody thing that makes me feel small. And another point, it's not just this is infantilization, it also, of course, increases inequality. For the very simple reason that for these adults, we're talking about people in their 20s and 30s with jobs, the sort of access to healthcare that they get depends not on them, but on whether or not they have relatively affluent parents. When I used to teach social mobility at Trinity, I always used to say to students, you want to know how to get a really good job and do really well in education, make sure you choose your parents carefully. Now, if you want to be healthy, make sure you choose your parents carefully. To end, what I tried to sketch out is the way in which precarious employment limits people's access to health care in Ireland. And it does so not so much because of the work itself, but because how this interacts with the particular form of welfare state, and in particular, the form of healthcare that we have. This creates Ireland's, what we might call Ireland's double whammy: extensive precarious employment, plus the lack of universal healthcare. But if you like, end on a good note. I think the whole experience of COVID-19 has highlighted not just the importance of regular employment relationships, but also how in a public health emergency, it's the public system that steps up, and it's the public system that gets political support. And perhaps we can end on that optimistic note. If we want to improve the health impact of precarious work, sort out the healthcare system. Thanks very much.
Thanks, James. It's a great presentation. I was just wondering, so I thought a lot of the statements there were revealing about not being able to afford private health insurance, and obviously that implies, people don't want to be waiting on waiting lists for X amount of years, and I think it's 800,000 people on waiting lists now. And this is a topic that's been coming up a lot over the year. What you mentioned there, in terms of universal health care, sláinte care, and in terms of this, what was being called a year ago a paradigm shift, but the state intervened. We saw all the power of the state to intervene, and to the importance of it in a crisis. But now, it kind of, I was at the National Economic Dialogue last week. There's a lot of this, talking about our fiscal position, our debt burden, etc., etc. And even with voices in the SRI talking about increasing, investment in the likes of housing and stuff. So although there seems to be or at least a year ago, there seemed to be signs of a paradigm shift. Got the IMF, the OECD, everybody seems to be on board. It doesn't seem to be the case, or at least there's some rollback on that in terms of the commentary, at least coming from government over the last couple of months. Do you think there has? Do you think that there has been a paradigm shift, or is there just a battle for that paradigm shift on the card?
I'm no expert on funding of healthcare, but I would have thought what's happened is, on the one hand, you have the whole launch of sláinte care as a project, if you like, as an aspiration, and I think there has been, in terms of public discussion, in terms of the statements of political parties, those sorts of things, a clear shift towards the need to have equal access to healthcare across the population. That sort of thing is there. Notice, incidentally, that access to universal healthcare is one of the social pillars of the new, whatever it's called, the new European. The new European social rights, which, of course, the ETUC has been particularly promoting. So I think, in terms of what people want, there has been a big change, and I think that's gone up nearly across the political spectrum. The only trouble is that, confronted by the need to actually do it, what is remarkable is the extent to which actually very little has happened. But notice there have been these little changes. I mean, access to GPs for children and for old people is now universal, for example, and that's actually quite dramatic in terms of historically the way we've had healthcare on. So I think, there's, what I'm saying is as the aspiration is now clearly there in the public domain, and part of the sort of progressive demands. I don't think yet, I think you're right, that as yet we haven't faced up to the simple fact that this will mean changes, and it will mean higher taxation, actually, and not just, and I'm afraid not just tax of the rich. You have to increase the tax base in order to do this sort of thing. Yeah, and it also to end the sláinte care, which will mean that people who with very, very good current health insurance will actually not get such good health care as they do at the moment. There will be a slight diminution at the top.
I'll live with that anyway. Okay, thanks a million, James. We'll get the next presentation up. Who's next now? It's Michael O'Brien from the International Transport Workers Federation. I think this is the first time he has presented for us. The name of the paper is 5 years on a review of the Atypical Work Permit Scheme for Non-EEA fishers working on Irish flag vessels. I believe this was in the news in the last year, and it's a very interesting topic. And take it away there, Michael, whenever you're ready.
Thanks very much, Kieran. And I do realise the title is a mouthful and it can appear like quite a niche topic, but there is a few relevant context to it, including a proposal at the moment going through the Dáil for a reform of the permit scheme, specifically for agricultural workers for seasonal permits. So I do think the atypical scheme for fishers does serve as a salutary case study, I would say. So the first thing I should just introduce the International Transport Workers Federation, or ITF, for people that are unfamiliar. People who are from the trade union movement would be acquainted with the organisation. It's a global umbrella body for trade unions that organise in the transport and maritime sector, 700 affiliates across the globe. So the Irish affiliates are SIP2, Unite and Forsa. Forsa from the point of view of aviation, the other two unions from the point of view of maritime, dock workers and the likes. The mainstay of the work in an Irish context will be the merchant marine. So yeah, occasions the ITF would appear in the Irish media. You get situations of bigger merchant marine vessels coming into Irish ports. The ship's company goes bust, and the ITF inspector will go try and chasing the wages and would engage with their colleagues, through the headquarters in London and so on, because there might be global collective bargaining agreements. But my specific brief is in the fishing sector, which is a recent enough diversification in the work of the ITF. My predecessor, Ken Fleming, who was seconded out from SIP2 to the ITF about 15 years ago to do mainly merchant marine work, discovered anecdotally that there was an emerging issue of abuses being experienced by non-EEA migrants on Irish flag fishing vessels, very much happening underground, out of sight from the point of view of the broad mass of people in Irish society. I think the sinking of the T-Bon fishing vessel in 2012 off the coast of Union Hall, which resulted in 5 fatalities, including 3 undocumented Egyptians, somewhat put it on the radar. But Ken, my predecessor, was agitating on this, but encountered a level of institutional resistance to addressing these issues and offering a path for regularisation and improvement of the conditions of non-EEA migrants. And really the massive turning point for us was the Guardian newspaper expose in late 2015. The journalist in question was Ella McSweeney, an Irish journalist who now writes for the Sunday Business Post, I think. And quite quickly, following on from that expose, which profiled the abuse of Filipino migrants on Irish-owned vessels, the Atypical Work Permit Scheme was launched on the back of a very rapidly produced government report. The scheme was capped at, and remains capped at 500. And interestingly, coming from a position of denial that this was an issue in Ireland, the boat owner representative organisations, when the idea of a cap of 500 was proposed, asked for a cap of 1,000 instead. But the first phase of the scheme, which you set a deadline for June 2016 to regularise the undocumented that were already operating in the state. Once that concluded, in the context of the media kind of furore dying down, unfortunately about half the cap was meant. So we still carried forward into the era of the atypical scheme a significant cohort of people remaining undocumented. And after June 2016, enrolment in the scheme is predicated on the fisher being in his. I'll use the male pronouns because they're all male, but in his country of origin. And the experience quickly encountered by my predecessor once the scheme was up and running was that the situation not only did not improve, but in some ways deteriorated, because for an undocumented migrant in the old regime, that once they were undocumented, and that actually afforded them a degree of mobility to be undocumented on different boats, and if they didn't like a particular vessel owner, they would go somewhere else. Whereas by coming out in the open and regularising the situation, they were actually more tied to the particular boat owner. And really the types of abuses that were common in the sector, which I'll go on to in a moment, just they hadn't altered, except people were doing it on a documented basis. So much so the conclusion was drawn that in effect the atypical scheme was perversely in the hands of some vessel owners becoming a tool for human trafficking by deception and forced labour. So much so that we successfully had referred to the Garda National Referral Mechanism for suspected victims of human trafficking, 32 cases, 24 of which were people that were actually enrolled in the atypical scheme. So High Court proceedings ensued, initiated by ourselves, but we were joined by the Irish Human Rights and Equality Authority and the Migrant Rights Centre of Ireland backed our High Court action as well. Our core arguments weren't upheld by the judge, but there was a mediation process in the end that resulted in a range of reforms that were ostensibly meant to tilt the balance somewhat more in favour of the migrant fisher. So that agreement was reached in April 2019, and really, in terms of bringing the situation up to date, in the aftermath of COVID intervening, which had an impact both on the work of the ITF, but also on the work of enforcement as well. And really, we've only been in a position in the last 5 months since I assumed the role I have as Fisheries campaign lead, in order to reacquaint ourselves with the situation. And a lot of the information I quote, it comes from parliamentary questions as opposed to the information that we can get directly from the various government departments and offices. So 227 permits in the sector spanning 180 eligible vessels. Basically, any vessel more than 15 metres in length is eligible to engage workers under the atypical scheme. I've face-to-face encountered 20 undocumented workers in the last 5 months. That's based on a small sample of vessels, and typically they come to us. 19 Egyptians, 1 Ghanaian. 2 of the Egyptians, by the way, were survivors of the Eli Adam sinking. People might recall on the 28th of March, the vessel sank off the coast of Castletown Bear, and 2 of the survivors were not undocumented Egyptians. So Workplace Relations Commission, yeah, it's fairly up-to-date information. They remotely inspected, in other words, they got vessel owners to show various pieces of documentation over Zoom links. They inspected 40 of the vessels and came up with 43 issues of non-compliance that ranged from non-payment of wages, non-payment of holiday pay, engaging non-EEA workers without a permit, and all the rest of issues of maritime non-compliance that are referred on to the Marine Survey Office. Just getting back to the issue of the human trafficking, which is topical because people may recall last week the US State Department published its annual trafficking in persons report, which again has Ireland alongside Romania as the only 2 EU countries on the Tier 2 watch list. That there's been no prosecutions to date arising from suspected cases of trafficking with regard to fishers that we have referred. And that's notwithstanding the significant amount of people we had accepted into the national referral mechanism. And what we've actually encountered is that because the DPP decided not to prosecute, not just ours, but even up until a month ago, we only had the first prosecution for human trafficking involving 2 sex workers, Nigerian sex workers, and the perpetrators that were convicted were Nigerian as well. But prior to that, there was no prosecutions for human trafficking or forced labour whatsoever since the 2008 Act was introduced. So some of the investigations are ongoing. So just a little bit about the migrant crew demographics. And taking documented and undocumented. And there's a big health warning here that we can't be precise about how many undocumented workers there are, but we can have a stab and say that if you consider 180 eligible vessels, we're talking probably in the realm of the mid to high hundreds. Of the 227 enrolled in the atypical scheme, it's 111 Filipino, 48 Egyptian, 28 Ghanaian, 28 Indonesian, and 12 other nationalities, probably from the Indian subcontinent. So you get occasional Ukrainians as well, and that represents a certain shift. The Egyptians were the predominant, and maybe if you factor in the undocumented are still the predominant, but there's a definite shift away from Egyptians towards Filipinos. And why is that? Well, our reckoning, and this is based on I suppose, qualitative discussions, interviews that we do with the fishers that we meet. We're very well networked with the Egyptian community, and the vast bulk of the previous referrals we had on human trafficking and forced labour were Egyptians. There was a minority of Ghanaians, but overwhelmingly Egyptians. A couple of Filipinos were within that. So they come to us, the Egyptians, and there's an increased vulnerability with the Filipinos and Ghanaians because they are more likely recruited through recruitment agencies, which the Egyptians aren't. The Egyptians come from a small amount of villages around the port of Alexandria, and by word of mouth, they make their own way over here, and they're not reliant on intermediaries like agencies. Whereas some of the agencies that would bring Filipinos and Ghanaians into the state, either legally or illegally. There's debt bondage that comes with that. And obviously the Ghanaians do speak English, so there's an added barrier with the Filipinos, who in the main speak Tagalog, or some would have some Spanish as well. The issue of living arrangements, your average Egyptian fisher and Ghanaians will live in what I would describe as DOS houses, the likes of the student accommodation of the 70s and 80s. You'll still see being inhabited now by your Egyptians, whereas the Filipinos oftentimes live on the vessels, making them much harder for us to reach. And then the issue of differing expectations and tolerance for abuse as well. It's just the case that the countries of origin, the Philippines is that bit more poorer than Egypt, and therefore the wages that they do manage to send home do make a massive difference. Whereas if the tolerance levels are a bit lower amongst the Egyptians in our experience, and they will kick up, although typically once they fall out with the vessel owner, and then we're trying to kind of retrieve unpaid wages retrospectively. There's the other point to make is the methodology of the stamp 4. So for people's information, the atypical scheme is a stamp 1 scheme with exemption. So you're tied to the vessel owner, the particular vessel owner, and they prize the idea of getting a stamp 4, which gives you some mobility. You can do any work, in fact, with a stamp 4. And there's a methodology amongst particularly the Egyptians, but it's there amongst all the fishers. And sometimes it's propagated by the vessel owners that you get an automatic entitlement to a stamp 4 after 5 years. Completely untrue, but there you go. And it does sustain some of them to accept the abuses. What are the abuses I keep referring to? The core one is overwork and undercrewing, which are both linked. And I was, in my naivety, I didn't know that people could work 18, 19, 20 hours a day plus days in succession, but these people do. And so you're talking about 100-hour plus weeks as a norm. It's completely normalized in the sector, whether you're documented or undocumented. So fatigue, injury typically arises from it. So you often have a story of, your Egyptian or Filipino is enrolled in the atypical scheme. They do the 20-hour days with 3 or 4 months to get injured, back injuries, hand injuries. They have to convalesce. Sometimes, particularly the Egyptians, will go back to their country of origin for a month or two to convalesce. But the boat owner has moved on, doesn't want to know them, but they still have the entry stamp and visa to get back into Ireland, and they end up odd jobbing on other vessels. So they're kind of half documented, so to speak. They're in that twilight zone. Poor onboard accommodation, and it's linked to the next point about the vessel conversion. What's happened is that the 180 or so eligible vessels, the largest vessels in the fleet, basically converted themselves so that they can do onboard processing, storage, refrigerated seawater, and likes to store the catch. And what was previously living accommodation back in the day when you would have had Irish people or even EU nationals on board is all storage and processing space now. So they're very poor accommodation space. There's issues of racism, issues of Islamophobia, particularly during the month of Ramadan. You're working a 20-hour day and then you're fasting as well from dawn to dusk. It does obviously impair the performance, and it does provoke an adverse reaction from some of the skippers, shall we say. Coercion into hiding overquoted catch, again, extremely topical. I see vessel owners and the recent flotilla protests about the blanket punitive intervention of the EU Commission, but arising from let's just say the poor performance of the Sea Fisheries Protection Authority, poor levels of inspections, but there's been a collective punishment to the entire fishing industry, including the smaller vessel owners who don't employ migrant labour. But I have to say, every single migrant we have interviewed, myself, my predecessor, that's on a boat that catches a quota species, to a man, they say that they have been coerced at some stage to hiding overquoted catch from the authorities. It's happening. It's out there. And then the issue of weak enforcement in the sector, both from the point of view of the Workplace Relations Commission and the Marine Survey Office. Again, just to give case studies, there was a case, again, it was in the newspaper in 2018, 4 Ghanaians who were all accepted into the national referral mechanism. They were on board for 3 months on the vessel in question. The vessel owner appeared in front of the district court, on charges from the Marine Survey Office. There were 20 infractions encountered, but they plea bargained away down to 6 that were uncontested. He got a €500 fine and €500 costs, and that's pretty normal. The fines are not dissuasive. There's been no improvement in the situation from the point of view of compliance in the 5 or 6 years of the atypical scheme, because there hasn't been any exemplary fines or punishments or jailings or anything handed down to non-compliant vessel owners. And then the issue of enforceability, which is an issue for all undocumented workers. If they don't have status in the country, you can get a ruling in the WRC for unpaid wages, a favourable one, but getting it enforced is a different question. And the vessel owners are aware of that. They can mount some resistance. And Ireland is, one of only 2 countries alongside Denmark that hasn't transposed the Employer Sanctions Directive, which gives parity for undocumented workers, who've been the victims of these type of abuses. So just in terms of the uncertainty ahead, like a lot of what I've given you is the product of parliamentary questions, but also an amount of anecdotal or qualitative, whichever way you want to look at it, information you've picked up and individual testimony from the migrant fishers. But the Maynooth Law Department, Maynooth University, are doing research on behalf of the ITF that will be published in September, we hope, on the basis of qualitative interviews and surveying the various responsible statutory bodies, just to appraise how since April 2019, when there were reforms agreed at the back of that High Court action, how the atypical system has operated. There are issues about quota reductions arising from Brexit, and then that punitive intervention I referred to from the EU Commission, and the possible layoffs. And you could have people who, there is an obligation on vessel owners to repatriate the non-EEA migrant at the end of their time, but it often doesn't happen. Many just remain in the country, and they can find jobs on an undocumented basis on other vessels. People may be aware that the Department of Justice have announced effectively an amnesty scheme that the details of which we'll know in September. It's likely that once you're in the country for 4 years and you've been working for those 4 years, even albeit undocumented, that you'll have a path towards getting probably a stamp 4. And it would be interesting to see how that pans out. I mean, in our own experience, what we anticipate is that vessel owners will still seek to recruit vulnerable, undocumented or half-documented migrant workers, because they, the fear of denunciation to the authorities, and it's just the power dynamic is so much more unfavourable than if they were to engage people that have a stamp 4, or even some have applied for Irish citizenship and have obtained it. Not many, but a few have. There are reforms underway in terms of the trafficking laws. Again, the IREC, the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, are a bit sceptical. There's still issues around victim identification and definitions. And so it remains to be seen, how that will pan out as well. I mentioned the Marine Casualty Investigation Board, which is a very poorly equipped statutory body, but when they do their investigations, they often uncover issues around overwork, fatigue, and the likes that, if it ought to result in better enforcement, because some of what they've investigated have been a fatal marine accidents involving fishers, including migrants fishers as well. But they don't have a retained inspectorate. But there is a report due out soon that the government commissioned from a retired British naval captain, Stephen Clinch, who we hope will make strong recommendations for it to be properly resourced, and the rest of it. So the ongoing investigation into trafficking cases I refer to, and the government is under pressure on this, as I say, from the US State Department. So we'll see if we get more results on that front as well, which may act to create a pressure for better compliance amongst vessel owners out there. So just kind of sum up with the measures we would argue are required to try and improve the situation. We need a comprehensive census of the crews and all the eligible vessels. The idea of 227 non-EEA migrants on 180 eligible vessels is just not credible. You have Irish skippers, you do have still some European Union based workers, but there's a missing cohort there of undocumented, and we need to find out who they are and then offer them a path to documentation or repatriation, whichever they prefer. And those that do decide to go back to their country of origin, they should be permitted to re-enter on a scheme in the future without any adverse question. These are people that have suffered abuses, and when we meet them, they will all have wages owed to them. You can be guaranteed that. There's a number of EU directives that have not been correctly transposed into Irish law. The one on the working time at sea, they've a wrong definition of a fisher, because there is a kind of a quasi self-employed category of a share fisher, as opposed to a wage earning one. I won't go into all the details, I'll digress too much. There's an issue of maintenance of crew list, which is a piece of essential paper keeping that there's no real stipulation about where the crew list is kept, but what we know is that where there's undocumented migrants on board Irish vessels, their names don't appear in any paperwork, and if those vessels go down, nobody will know that they were aboard, and that's the reality. And that would have been the case with the 2 Egyptians who survived the Ali Adams sinking in March. I made the point already about enforceable rulings from the Workplace Relations Commission. There is a provision in the Employment Permits Act 2003, Section 2B, that where an undocumented migrant is adversely affected by their, not being paid wages over a period of months, that the minister can initiate an investigation, and basically there's an indirect route by which some restitution can be obtained. And there's a parliamentary question response due later this week to see how many times the minister and his predecessors have used that provision. The ITF has not had a happy experience with it, is all I'll say, and there will be a particular case that we'll be going public about in the course of the next week or two, if all goes to plan. The issue of minimum crewing levels on fishing vessels, believe it or not, the only laws that are there pertain to what kind of skills need to be on board in terms of engineering skills, a qualified skipper, but actually in terms of crewing levels themselves. And it links back to the point about overwork, the people working the 18, 19, 20-hour days. There's insufficient crew on these vessels. It's penny pinching by the employers. So yeah, the plea bargaining point I made about the Marine Survey Office, and it just feeds into this thing of non-dissuasive penalties. The Marine Casualty Investigation Board point made already. Just a very basic reform, and the bottom line for us is that if the fisher had more mobility within the sector, if they were encountering abuses and were in a position to come to the ITF, we can investigate, put in applications to the Workplace Relations Commission to retrieve wages or whatever, and they have the wherewithal to go and maybe work for a better employer within the sector, like that would be a very important. It was something that we argued from the very, very outset. We had grave misgivings about tying the fisher to particular vessel owners, which is the way it works. Just going back to the trafficking issue, that the national referral mechanism, the only route to being admitted into that is via the Garda Síochána. There is a proposal from the government to allow other state agencies, the HSE, TUSLA in the case of child trafficking, and then unnamed NGOs. Now we're angling, if you pardon the pun, for the ITF to be able to admit people into the referral mechanism, because there's no other NGO kind of operating in the field of fishing. Now we do recognise that like the migrant fishers are a small cohort in terms of undocumented workers in this country that are open to, there are sites of exploitation and possible trafficking, say compared to sex workers, agricultural workers, or all the rest of them. Still, some of the most extreme abuses are, in our experience, are happening in that sector. And then just the final point really is just an enhanced role and recognition for the ITF. You see, the problem we have is that because the atypical permits are renewed annually, you have a certain churn. And goes back to the point I made earlier that there's a cohort now, the bulk, in fact, of the 227 people that are actually documented, we don't know who they are. We know what their nationality is. We have an idea about where they're based. And some of them are living on vessels. And it's potluck, really. We're reliant on informal networks. We go to the mosques, we go to the Filipino community network, we try where we can to see, and it's pure potluck. In some occasions that some of them will find out who we are, or sometimes if they have a catastrophic injury, as was once the case with a Filipino, lost 3 digits, and then eventually he found his way to the ITF. But what we would require is that at the very outset, once the Department of Justice issues a letter of approval for the engagement of a fisher under the atypical scheme, that fisher is made aware of the existence of the ITF and what our role is, and that we can tell them what the pitfalls is. We can tell the fisher at the outset, you independently record the hours that you work on that vessel, so that we have something to contest the falsified timesheets that are produced sometimes in workplace relation committees. Tell them that it's not acceptable to work 20-hour days, very basic stuff, and all the rest of it, and give them, if you like, the option that if they do want to break with an abusive situation, that they have a path to speaking to a sympathetic organisation that will do what it can to uphold their rights.
Right. Okay. Thanks a million, Michael. We're getting a bit tight on time, but I have one question that's very comprehensive, and it's a very interesting topic. And I remember reading that report in the Guardian. I'm just, you mentioned institutional pushback and compliance with EU directives and no arrests, and have you any idea as to why there's such foot dragging? Or
if I could be candid about it, I think that the popular view was that the fishing sector has been very put upon. It's a sector under pressure with declining stocks, with quota cuts, small, rural villages. It's a way of life. And there's a queasiness on the part of certain government departments about cracking down on abuses. And it seems that there's an acceptance that forced labour and human trafficking is a reality in Ireland, but they find it difficult to accept that it's a reality in the fishing sector. I mean, just to give an example, in response to the US State Department's TIP report last week, Junior Minister Hildegard Naughton put out a statement. Obviously, it was written by the civil servants of the Department of Justice, but they singularly contested the allegations in fishing. They expressed general disappointment, pointed to the improvements they make, didn't contest the reality of trafficking and forced labour among sex workers and other sectors, but singularly. And I think they really don't want to bite the bullet, and that there are some vessel owners that are maybe pillars of their community that are doing some very bad things, that it's politically toxic for them, and I think that's really what we're up against.
Okay, well, we look forward to that story coming up in the next couple of weeks. You mentioned anyway. Thanks a million, Michael, and we'll move on now. We've got Daniel Hoey, and Daniel's going to present his findings on meaningful employment barriers and aspirations for mothers on low incomes. And he's a research coordinator with Focus Ireland, and we're really looking forward to this presentation. Take it away there, Daniel, whenever you're ready.
Thanks very much, Kieran. It's great to be here, and it's great to follow two very interesting presentations from James and Michael as well. So I'm going to speak about a paper that was born out of Focus Ireland's involvement in an EU-funded study entitled REGAL, which stands for Regaining Life for Precarious Women at Work. First, I'll give an overview of the research project. So for those on the call who don't know, the organisation I work for is Focus Ireland, which is a national housing and homelessness NGO working to prevent people from becoming homeless in the first instance and supporting people out of homelessness as quickly as possible. So we were one of 5 NGOs around Europe who took part in this REGAL project. So we and each of those NGOs in those countries, so there's Romania took part, there's an NGO in France, Portugal, and Belgium as well. So they all worked with different cohorts of women who were marginalised. So for example, in Ireland, the cohort that we worked with was women with experience of homelessness. And for example, in France, it was women from a migrant West African background. In Romania, it was women living in poverty from rural regions, etc. And the main aim of the REGAL project was to identify gaps in the current EU legislation pertaining to women on the margins and to propose solutions to reduce the number of working women in poverty and to collate and articulate those solutions at the EU level. So for the project in Ireland, so we worked with a core group of 16 women who had experienced homelessness and have a care responsibility, so namely caring for children or being mothers. And we worked in 12 focus groups over the course of November 2019 to March 2020. Unfortunately, COVID came along and put an end. We were hoping to have a couple of more focus groups to explore different things that were emerging, but fortunately we were able to organise several qualitative interviews over the phone during the pandemic to help us kind of to finish our work. We recruited the women through Focus Ireland Services. So we call the participants co-researchers. This is a participatory research project, essentially. So our co-researchers were recruited through services, and it included both women who had exited homelessness to typically, you know, an approved housing body house or a local authority house, or indeed the private rented sector, typically through HAP, or who were in homeless accommodation, but were in a stable situation and were supported, which was key. They had you know, robust support by staff as well. So the kind of main aim was to explore work-life balance barriers and aspirations. So this EU project is part of the directive, the work-life balance directive. So the main aim was to look at work-life balance barriers, and obviously employment was a big part of that. So in terms of the policy context, I'm not going to dwell on this, particularly for this audience, so I'm not going to labour these points. Like, these are all well established. So, you know, historically Ireland has not been a progressive country in terms of the development of provisions to facilitate women to combine work and family life. We know that one-parent families headed by women have the lowest employment rate at around 60%. In-work poverty is a very real issue, and it's been data has shown that it's been increasing over the last number of years. Access to childcare, you know, Ireland ranks among one of the world's most expensive countries for providing childcare, something that's been well established for a number of years. And then the feminisation of homelessness comes into play here as well. So one of the most striking aspects of homelessness trends in this country over the last decade or so is the increase of women in the homeless figures, and particularly women who are heads of families entering into emergency accommodation, most of whom have never experienced homelessness before and are homeless for economic reasons. And this, I think, this speaks to the level of poverty that women are experiencing in Ireland, in particular cohorts. So yeah, that figure there just you know, really that established you know, poverty and care work often for women in particular results in labour market exclusion. So this particular project gave voice to a group of women who were experiencing that. So I'm going to talk about a bit of the methodology that we use, because I think it's important, and it's a relatively new progressive methodology that you know, it's participatory in nature, and it's a framework that was developed for research work with marginalised groups, and it was developed by Mary Murphy and Rory Hearn from Maynooth University as part of the Reinvest European project, which took place about four years ago or so. So you can see in this figure here, there's 4 key stages. So there's a trust building phase, a capacity building phase, followed by inquiry, and then lastly, you're talking about outcomes then. So if you just look under those key kind of stages, so in terms of trust building, you know, that started at a very early stage for us through our recruitment process, engaging with gatekeepers and our services staff, and ensuring the right protections are there for the participants or co-researchers in the project. So once we had recruited, it was this was a diverse group of women. So we had kind of 3 subgroups, I suppose. There was women from an Irish background, there was women from the Roma community, and there was women from an African background as well. So we really had to concentrate on building solidarity at an early stage. So building solidarity around care work and the care work they provide, and how it impacts on their life. And we also, at that point, we worked with an artist called Fiona Whelan, who she's also a lecturer in the Institute of Art and Design as well up on Thomas Street, and she does a lot of work with marginalised groups. And Fiona worked as a consultant on this, so we created a character, and we call this character Faith. And the purpose of Faith was a device that the women could speak to and through. So, like, if you imagine we're covering sensitive topics, and we want women to speak comfortably, and we don't want them to speak we want to offer an alternative to speaking in very personal terms. So we created this character called Faith, and a lot of the work that we did was through Faith, and indeed Faith was the main creative output of the project. And we developed a diary for Faith, which is a website that I'll show later on. So in terms of the capacity building, that's kind of a learning process through the focus group. So we're spending time on talking about things like the double burden, we're talking about human rights, and we also dedicate some time to look at the election manifestos of various parties, because the general election was around that time, and we took the opportunity to review manifestos and particular policy concerns related to the group. In relation to inquiry, so we had the research sessions or the focus groups. The women in our co-researchers wrote some letters to Faith, so they would offer advice or just talk about their experiences. And we had photo diaries that kind of illustrated the amount of work that the women were doing through the course of the day, in terms of their care work and looking after their children. And we've done some budgeting exercises as well. And then lastly, in terms of the outcomes, so storytelling was a big part, and we used Faith to tell the story, and as well proposing solutions. So we looked at developing solutions, which I'll speak to in a couple of minutes. So in terms of the profile of our co-researchers, of which I said at the top there were 16 in this core group. So in terms of their accommodation situation, so 6 were in emergency accommodation, 6 were in focus housing or approved housing, body housing, 2 were in the private rented sector, and 2 were in social housing. In terms of relationships, so the majority of the women were lone parents, but even enough split, I suppose, between lone parenthood and being in a couple. All of the women had children, so between 1 and 4 children in the households. And importantly, in terms of labour market status, so 11 of the women were not in employment or education. 5 were taking part in the P programme, which is a Focus Ireland service, which stands for Preparation for Education, Training and Employment, which is, it's a part-time course of sorts. And then 1 of the women was self-employed. So when we look at the findings of the focus groups and the qualitative research that we did in terms of meaningful employment aspirations and barriers, so at a very early stage in those focus groups, we looked at aspirations. So what types of aspirations did the women have in terms of employment? And from the outset, this was a very difficult topic to explore with the group. Like, we were met with a lot of awkward silences, and we had to kind of employ a number of techniques and exercises to like articulate this. Aspirations were often framed by the women in the group in terms of wanting the best for the children and being a good mother. So they weren't aspirations for self, they were selfless aspirations for their children and wanting the best for their kids. And we found that primary role that they had of carer, coupled with the poverty they were experiencing, stunted any employment goals or further aspirations and future planning in their lives. And you'll see that illustration there, that these illustrations feature in some of the outputs we did. We employed a very talented illustrator to work with us and to develop that diary, Faith's diary, that on the website. But when we did get to a point of asking, when we posed the question, look, if care work was looked after, if you weren't the primary care for your children, and like most of your time wasn't taken up with that, like, what would you like to be, or what are your career goals? So lots of things came up: army officer, nurse, and working in social or healthcare, beautician, lawyer, dancer, clothes designer, counsellor, and accountant. So that's just a flavour of some of the career aspirations that the women had, but they were kind of, I suppose, buried to a degree because they were, operating in the present and taking care of their children and putting food on the table. So when we looked at the kind of the barriers to any kind of sense of meaningful employment, unsurprisingly, childcare was the main thing that came up with the women in the group. So for women, the childcare is still very expensive, particularly for the cohorts who were in flexible work. the women felt, and you know, the majority of the women had work experience, so they could speak to that, but their perception was that you know, they were working just to pay for childcare, and they had to balance that out and weigh that up in terms of the choices that they made. There was a reliance on informal arrangements with a lot of time with friends or family in terms of looking after children and allowing the researchers and the women in the group to seek employment or to work. You know, childcare was often not available when the mothers needed it. So, you know, both informally and formally. So that would be on the weekends or evenings and night shifts. Some of the group had experience working in, you know, healthcare, and a lot of the time, their shifts would be on the weekends, and they would have night shifts. And the childcare options were limited in that capacity. Transport to and from childcare was an issue as well, particularly for lone parents or indeed dual worker households. So getting to creche was difficult for some of the women in the group. And after school activities as well was something that was spoken about quite significantly, and how after schools activities would be of a real benefit, particularly to mothers whose, you know, children would be of that primary school age, and to have, you know, more free time available. And that would be really helpful if they were to, you know, seek meaningful employment opportunities. So in terms of this next slide, you know, really to hit home the idea, or the importance, I should say, of childcare. These are some pictures of how we facilitate the research, and this is an outhouse on Capel Street where we done it, and they were great. So every Friday we had the focus groups, and you know, you can see from the picture in the top left there, we had a designated space, a childcare space. We had to employ 3 childcare workers to look after the kids. And you can see in that picture there, this is what we were greeted with every Friday was, you know, a line of buggies in the hallway, just at the bottom of the stairs. That was the reality of the situation for the co-researchers. And you can see another picture there of our focus group facilitator with a newborn baby in her hands. A lot of the focus groups, we had a newborn baby, and like very young children who were there, who weren't, the mothers were just not comfortable leaving their young kids with the childminders next door. So that was the reality of the situation, and we had to provide childcare. It would have been impossible otherwise. So again, looking at, you know, key barriers, precarious work came up, very significant. So the experience of the women where, you know, part-time jobs often require high levels of availability and flexibility by employees, but that doesn't really necessarily apply to employers. Sorry, that should be employers there in the first line. And the experience of work for this group was often for low pay and poor conditions. For few progression opportunities within those roles. And you know, the very real issue of less social insurance coverage was a real factor, and indeed that limited recognition of care generally in the social insurance system is detrimental to this group. There was an expectation from employers that the women didn't have a life when they were in work, and this really related to, you know, not being able to answer the phone if there was an emergency at home, if they had a friend looking after their child. You know, it was really hard to take a call, and in these kind of poor quality jobs. And they felt that they were exploited a lot of times in the jobs that they had worked in the past, and that they were easily replaceable. And there was a fear there in terms of rocking the boat and losing their jobs. And, you know, ultimately the types of work that they felt were realistically available to them were just not worth it when they, you know, they weighed up what was important in their lives in terms of providing the best of care for their children. So another key finding that came up in the work that we did with the women was around upskilling and exploring, you know, well, is upskilling the answer, and how accessible is upskilling? So there was a recognition with the group that, you know, better quality jobs require, you know, qualifications and training. And indeed, some of the women, particularly the women from an African background, did have qualifications in nursing and healthcare, but were not able to pursue those roles because of caring responsibilities. But the group felt that, a lot of upskilling opportunities were inaccessible and inflexible. There was high costs attached to some of the courses that they were interested in, and often the hours and the structure of upskilling our courses was family unfriendly, really, and that they just weren't able to commit to these particular courses or training opportunities, and that they would have preferences maybe to split courses or training into like attainable blocks per se, or modules. There was a real fear of the unknown and how, like, if you were to take up a training or educational opportunity, how this was impact on social welfare entitlements, and that's the stability and that income that's supported, and would you be penalised for doing certain courses and committing to a number of hours, and this was the case for some of the women. There was a real lack of self-confidence as well. These women had been in that unemployment trap for a long time, and the question was, am I able for this? I don't know if I'm able to partake in education and to go back to school or to go back to college. The women operated, in a practical mindset. It was, focusing on realistic work opportunities in the here and now, and providing for the children and putting food on the table, rather than kind of any, aspirational sense of roles into the future. So that was the reality for many of the women. So in moving on to, like, in terms of exploring solutions, and again, we did this as a group in these focus groups. So what we did was we used the general election at the time to gather all the manifestos of the political parties and pull out the relevant policies, and we worked with the women to examine and rank their preferences in terms of policy. So these pictures just illustrate the work that we were doing in the focus groups, and just asking the women to work in groups and to rank what policies were important to them. So these pictures just give a sense of that.
We'll call it 3 minutes there, Daniel. Okay.
Cool. And so there's the identified policy preferences there. So this is what we collated then after the work with the group. So these were the three main policy preferences. So we're talking paid family leave, and in relation to that, parental care in early years, paid leave for all parents, and longer flexible shared leave, inclusive childcare. So affordability, accessibility, including transport, and after school, again, was really key. And then lastly, family-friendly workplaces. So, having a right to flexible work, family-friendly work, and a right to certain hours as well. And that speaks to the poor quality contracts that were on offer, and 0-hour contracts, etc. So to conclude, a lack of inclusive childcare forces women on low incomes into unemployment or precarious work. And that precarious work provides little stability or security. In terms of upskilling, there was a real dearth of affordable courses and ones that were accessible and took into account the responsibilities of mothers, particularly on low incomes. A lot of the women were trapped in unemployment, and this I didn't touch on here, but this had a really significant impact on mental health and self-confidence, and importantly, that self-confidence to re-engage with the labour market. And then those solutions that were co-produced were viewed in policy terms as paid family leave, inclusive childcare, and family-friendly workplaces. And lastly, I just want to talk about some of the outputs. So we have some national papers, and each NGO fed into an EU synthesis report, also an EU storybook, which includes a number of case studies of women who are involved in the variety of projects around Europe. And we have a methodology toolkit as well. So these are all available on regalproject.eu. And the Testing Fate website is the creative output of our project in Ireland, and that's the link there, which I would implore people to have a look at. That just illustrates what it's like for women in this group, the women that we worked with, through a character called Faith. So thanks very much, Kieran.
Okay, that's again very comprehensive, very interesting study. I just like, it's more of a comment, maybe you comment back, but I mean, we and NERI have been, you know, pushing childcare for years, especially the director Tom McDonald there, on, you know, participation rates and where we fall down in Europe. And as you said, the barriers to employment. But the title there is low income, but I feel like this is even, you know, impacting middle income.
Yeah.
It's impacting a generation. It's coming through on some of the statistics there. In 2019, in the Silk, the survey on income and living conditions showed that there was an uptick in material deprivation rates in a year of employment growth, in a year of wage growth, in a year of, you know, consumption, GDP growth, all the good things, and yet there was a growing percentage of people who couldn't afford basic necessities. And when you looked into the groups who it was young women. And now again, I'm just looking through some of the data now. Women under 40 seem to have taken a particular hit as well in employment during the pandemic. So this is, you know, this interaction between caring when the schools were closed, etc. And the figures are very high, like just relative to the average. So I don't know if you have a comment on that.
No, I think it just really speaks to the gender nature of it, Kieran, and yeah, I imagine it does, and the figures show that it doesn't just impact people on low incomes or women on low incomes, that it is, you know, people on middle incomes now. So it's a real concern.
And hopefully, you know, we're talking again. I keep bringing up the paradigm shift and the sea change and all this kind of stuff that COVID has, you know, forced upon us. And you know, we're looking into this. We're looking into high unemployment, which means, you know, the precarious nature and the relationship between those women and their bosses. You were saying about not being able to take phone calls, etc. I saw in my local deli there an ad for, you know, CVs wanted have to be completely flexible. Now that's a quote. I don't know what that means, you know. And this could get worse before it gets better, I think, and that's a real thing to keep an eye on. Anyway, I just gonna wrap up the session now and actually wrap up the day. And so I'd like to thank our three last presenters there, Daniel, Michael, and James, for great presentations. And I'd also like to, in particular, thank Paul Goldrick-Kelly and Louisa of the NERI, who organised this whole thing, dozens again of great presentations. And as I said, this kind of stuff doesn't organise itself. So great job, and hopefully we'll see you all soon in person next year. That the conference will be somewhere in a lecture theatre or something like that. And that's it. And thanks to everybody for tuning in. And all the presentations, slides, and videos will be uploaded onto the NERI website as well for anybody who wants to see them or wants to share them. We'll tweet them out as well. All right. Thanks a million, and all the best.